Hello and welcome to our lecture on the 1950s. We're going to be focusing in this lecture on the economy of the 1950s here in the United States and looking at the economic prosperity for many people here in the United States during the decade. Okay, so first of all, we need to talk about this time period of readjustment and recovery. So it's important that you understand that in the 1950s, Americans had money to spend. They had had years of going without. And this going without the ability to spend money had led to this consumer hunger, right? People wanted to buy a bunch of stuff. So if you think about it, kind of go back in our minds to what we've been studying, if you remember the Great Depression of the 1930s, right, people literally didn't have money to spend, so they couldn't spend any money. Then we have the decade of the 1940s, which is World War II. During this time, we saw an increase in women who were working in war-related jobs. We saw men who had jobs, a lot of soldiers. However, so Americans had money, but they weren't able to spend their money, right? Women were too busy working. Men were too busy fighting in the war. So we see people earning money, but not actually able to spend it. In addition, during World War II here in the United States, we had what was called rationing. Rationing was limiting what people were able to buy. So the government wanted to make sure that there was enough of all of the things for people and for the military. So they created rations on different goods, and you were only allowed to purchase a certain number of things each week or each month. And so this, again, limits while Americans may have the money, this limits what they're actually able to spend the money on during the 1940s. By the end of World War II, Americans have saved approximately $135 billion. And so as we enter into the 1950s, there's this desire to spend this money. All right. Another reason why we see so many Americans with money was because of the GI Bill. The GI Bill provided a reward for soldiers returning home for the war, most of them. The reason why we saw this happen was because the government wanted to avoid another bonus army like they saw in the 1930s. If you remember, we talked about the bonus army march, where World War I soldiers and their families marched to the U.S. Capitol and demanded that they be paid their bonus early because of the Depression. And so the government wants to avoid another one of these, so they actually provide the GI Bill and money to returning soldiers. In addition, there was a fear of another depression. If you have 10 million soldiers returning home from war, and if they don't have access to education or they don't have access to jobs or a way to buy things, there was a fear that there would be another Great Depression. So this was a way to put money in people's hands. Now, the way it worked was it wasn't just cash given to soldiers. This allowed for a couple of things. Number one, it paid for education. So if you wanted to go and go to college and get a higher education, the GI Bill could subsidize that for returning soldiers. We saw a huge wave in the 1950s of college construction as a direct result of this. So here in California, we see campuses like UC San Diego, woohoo, go Tritons, built during the 1950s in addition to UC Irvine. And right here in the Bay Area, CSU East Bay, used to be CSU Hayward, Cal State Hayward, was also built during the 1950s in order to provide a place for all of these returning soldiers to be educated. In addition to, and keep in mind, as all these schools are being built, that's also providing jobs, right? All of these commercial construction jobs are providing jobs for people. In addition, we see the GI Bill offer a low interest rate mortgage. So your mortgage is the house, the payments that you make, right? It's the loan that you take out from the bank and you make a monthly mortgage payment toward that loan. Well, the interest rates determine how much interest you pay in addition to just the cash loan that you take out. So the GI Bill provided for low interest rate loans for returning soldiers. This led to an explosion in home buildings in the 1950s, which allows the houses for these soldiers to buy, but also jobs in residential construction. So we see homes that people can afford and also jobs for people. And then finally, the GI Bill provided low interest rate loans. So again, borrowing money, right, at a low interest rate to start a business. And once again, if you think about it, right, if you have returning soldiers starting businesses, they're most likely hiring people to work in these businesses with them. So again, we see the creation of jobs through this entire system and through this time as well. In addition to this recovery and readjustment in the 1950s, we also see a changing economy. A couple of new, maybe not new, but a couple of business models that really take off during this time are franchises and conglomerates. So a franchise is where someone opens a business that a larger company owns, but the owner uses the established name and the business model to run their business. So some examples of this are McDonald's, Subway, Supercuts, or Ace Hardware. So if somebody decides they want to open up an Ace Hardware, they go and they find a building, they contact Ace Hardware and they say, hey, I want to open an Ace Hardware. Well, that person is responsible for that location. That is their store. They own it. However, they have to run their business the way that Ace Hardware tells them to run their business. They pay a franchise fee in order to have the Ace Hardware, but then they're provided things like all the marketing materials, right? They're instructed on how to run their business. This allows anyone to own a business, right? You pay that fee, and then you make the food or you run the business the way that the larger company tells you to do it. So this allows for a lot more business ownership, right? This allows for entrepreneurship, but in a less risky way. In addition, we see a lot of conglomerates being formed during the 1950s. This is where a corporation owns many smaller businesses. This really allows a company to diversify and grow quite large. So they might buy all these small businesses, but then as the corporation, the conglomerate is growing really big. An example that you may know is GE. It actually stands for General Electric, but they have businesses in healthcare. They've got energy, they've got transportation. They also own a number of television networks like History Channel or Telemundo, including many others. Now, this can be really dangerous if GE fails, right? Because then so many businesses are affected. However, mostly this business model has allowed our economy and the American economy to grow quite large. And we see this take off in the 1950s. In addition to these types of businesses and new forms of businesses that we also see higher paying jobs. Often we call these white collar jobs. White collar jobs increased by 25% in the decade of the 1950s. In addition, we see salaried employees increase by 60% during this time. Now, a salaried employee is somebody who makes a set amount of money per year. They typically have time off for vacation, they have paid sick time, and they generally also get benefits. This is really helpful for the American economy because it provides a stability, right, in their job and in the economy. Now, in addition, most white-collar jobs do require higher education, and so we see a higher demand for education because more people want these white-collar or these higher-paying jobs. So again, more demand for education, we need more colleges built, and we see that cycle continue of more jobs available. All right, and then we also see this changing economy really take place in the sales industry. Sales, advertising, and communication industries explode during the 1950s. We saw a large increase with the radio in the 1920s, but with the increase of televisions, we see a huge boom in all of these industries. A TV becomes a household staple during this decade. According to TV history, in 1950, 9% of households in the United States had or owned a television. By 1959, the end of the decade, 86% of households have televisions, and by 1978, 98% of houses now have a TV in their house. So this revolutionized how companies are advertising. In addition, as that changes, that's providing new jobs in the advertising industry. So we see, again, the sales industry completely change with the advent of the television and jobs being added to the market. Okay. The other thing is we see this change in that the fact that the consumption really becomes the foundation of the economy. There was an increasing demand for consumer goods in the 1950s because of that money to spend and because of the advertising convincing people to to buy goods. They need this, right? We see this increasing desire to spend. It's kind of similar to the 1920s and the idea of consumerism that we talked about, right? This idea that buying products is good for the economy. We see the credit card, kind of a generic credit card introduced in the 1950s where people can buy now and pay later. We also see this idea that what we buy actually says something about who we are. It shows our community how well we are doing and just how American we are. And in this time period of strong conformity, we see this as a way for Americans to conform and to show just how well they're doing and how good they are at being an American. There was a pressure to compete with and keep up with your neighbors. And it didn't matter if you could afford it or not, right? You could use credit. The most important thing was keeping up and was staying in the game. And advertising contributed to that mindset, as well as the ability for many Americans, not all, many Americans to be able to purchase a lot of these different things. All right. And then, as you can imagine, this also all led to the rise of the suburbs in the 1950s. The suburbs was new home construction that was happening outside of the cities. This is where they began to apply the assembly line process to home building. Houses would come in parts, and workers would work to put those parts together. So you would have the foundation team and come in and pour all the foundations in a neighborhood. Then you would have the carpenters come in and put up all the walls. Then you would have all the electricians come through and do the wiring. Then all the plumbers come through. You get the idea, right? And so this idea that you have the specialties come into the neighborhood and go through the neighborhood and put everything together. As I mentioned, this was really happening outside of cities. And because of the way that these homes were being constructed, this really led to homes being able to be built very quickly and a lot less expensively. Is that the way to say that? It costs a lot less money to build homes in this way. Levittown becomes the first recognized planned suburb. This was outside of New York City. It was in the state of New York. And this allowed thousands of American families to become first-time homeowners because they could afford these homes. Again, not all. In addition to kind of outside of cities, it's also important to note that the rise of suburbs really matched the freeway or the interstate system. The Highway Act of 1956 was passed by President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower was the president throughout pretty much the entire decade. He was elected in 1952 and reelected in 1956. This was the largest public works project in American history. It provided $32 million for 40,000 miles of highways that stretched across the country. This allowed for the easy transportation of goods and services. Now, companies don't have to rely on railroads or ships or airplanes. They can have semi-trucks that ship their goods, right? And they can own those trucks even. In addition, it connected our nation in a way that hadn't been connected before. People don't need to rely on trains or air travel to actually travel to other places. People can now drive anywhere they want. Now, again, one of the reasons why we see the suburbs, it all comes kind of full circle, right? People have money because of the GI Bill, and the suburbs rise because people have money because of the GI Bill. Again, if you remember, one of the conditions, one of the things that the GI Bill provided for were low interest rate mortgages so that these returning soldiers could actually buy these homes and people could afford it. In addition, Americans very much became, during the 1950s, an automobile nation. According to Oakley's book, God's Country, America in the 50s, by the end of the 1950s, 80% of American families had at least one car. 15% of American families had two cars. Right? This allows people to, number one, commute into those cities for their jobs more easily, but also for people to move across the country and to move around and visit things much more easily than they had before. That highway system allows for easy travel. In addition, we see automobile industry changing as well, and they begin to introduce new models of cars every year, right? And that consumption ethic of like buying fuels that as well. You've got to always have the most recent and the latest and the newest car with the newest color and the newest features. And so all of these changing styles and options in the automobile industry fuel that consumption as well. And more people have that money and they want those cars. In addition, right, so the suburbs, the automobile nation, the fact that people have cars make it so people can commute and live in the suburbs and still get to work and travel where they need to go. We also saw a huge population increase in the 1950s. There was 197.6% population growth during this decade. According to Dinar's book, America in the 50s, the California population increased 49%. Florida's population increased 79%. And again, we see across the nation a huge increase in the population, and the cities really become too crowded. This is the generation that we know as the baby boom generation. Okay, these were people born between 1946 and 1964. World War I ended in 1945. Okay, so it's the generation born right after World War II. My parents' generation. So I'll put their picture there for you because they make me happy. This is the largest generation in US history. And this is, again, this explosion of babies after World War II. A couple of reasons why. You can imagine couples were apart during the war. So now that soldiers are returning home, they're anxious to start a family. They want to return to normalcy and kind of get back to what life was supposed to be. In addition, we saw advances in medicine during this decade that significantly decreased the child mortality or death rate here in the United States. We had fewer kids dying in childhood. There was medicine advances in addition to the polio vaccine, which significantly helped with the, obviously, polio and the rate of polio here in the United States. So for most people, the suburbs provided affordable housing. Now, if you remember back to last semester, it's important that you understand that not everybody was actually able to access these homes that were built. Okay, there was significant racial discrimination that were put in place to keep African Americans out of the suburbs. Approximately 1.2 million Black veterans did not actually receive the GI Bill. So they weren't actually able to access the benefits of that. In addition, if you remember the concept of redlining, right? Banks would give loans to people if they wanted to buy a home in an area that was deemed a good or a safe investment. An area that was deemed as not safe or not good investment, they were highlighted in red. Well, most of those neighborhoods were neighborhoods where Black families were living. So if a Black family was renting a home and saved up and were able to purchase a home, they could not actually get a bank to give them the loan to purchase in their neighborhood. In addition, real estate agents wouldn't even show African American families homes outside of those neighborhoods. So while the suburbs certainly did allow for the fulfillment of the American dream for many people, the idea of owning a home for millions of American families, it's also important that we recognize and realize that there was a significant chunk of our population that was left out of this dream, that was held back and was not allowed to access this dream of homeownership during this decade. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at any time, and I will try to get back to you, or you can talk to me more in class. Again, I mentioned we will talk more about this GI Bill in class and look at the implications of that, in addition to looking at the people who were left out of that. Thank you so much and have a great day.